Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, we give thanks for the people that you place in our lives who can help us to grow in wisdom, as well as the wisdom that you place within each of us. Amen. So this morning, I'm going to talk a bit about the value of quantity time. You've heard of spending quality time with people? Well, I'm going to talk about its corollary, quantity time. I was slow to put together in my mind the value of quantity time. I had experienced it, and on some level I knew it was something of value, but I guess I had to put it into practice and then reflect on those practices later to sort of figure it out for myself. One early learning that I remember is when I was an intern in seminary. My internship church was multilingual and multicultural. The worship service was in Mandarin and then overlap in Mandarin and English, and then in English. And then many of the people in the church spoke other Chinese dialects and other languages as well. So it was a complicated place, culturally and linguistically. And so I was an intern in this church, and one of the things I was supposed to do is to help with children's and youth ministry. That was one of my areas of responsibility, and I felt totally unequipped to do either one of those things. And so my mentor, my supervisor, made a deal with me. And so in exchange for doing children's and youth ministry, I would be able to teach adult classes at the church, which I felt much better suited to do. That was my cookie in exchange for doing the chores of the children and youth. And so I did, and I wasn't very well suited to it, honestly. But my mentor, my supervisor, kept encouraging me, like, just keep showing up. Just keep showing up. If you show up, that's almost all the work you have to do. Just show up. In my mind, I'm thinking, there's no way that's true, right? I'm just piling error on error. This can't be making anything better. But I was an intern there for 2 years, and over those 2 years, I realized it actually did help. That showing up was the key to opening up relationships with these kids, with these youth, a few of which I still have, like 15 years later. Another time I started to absorb the value of quantity time was during clinical pastoral education, which is part of training to be a minister. And what you normally do is you spend time as a chaplain serving in a ministry that isn't church. So you might serve in the prison, or you might serve in often it's a hospital, it might be a hospice, etc. So I served in the hospital, and some of my units were the intensive care unit, which can get pretty rowdy, and the inpatient behavioral health unit and the outpatient behavioral health unit. So some challenging things. And the program, the CPE program I was in, it was about 80 hours a week, because you'd be working full-time as a chaplain and then also putting in school time. And a lot of that was one-to-one discussion, a bit like group therapy. And so you ended up crying a lot. I kind of feel like they didn't feel like they'd succeeded if you didn't cry at least once a week in CPE. And most of us did. So good for them. But again, I got to the point where I was so burnt out and I was so just at a loss that all I could do was keep showing up, because I didn't have another option. If I dropped out of CPE, I dropped out of seminary, and I just wasted 4 years of my life. So I kept showing up and continued to learn and continued to contribute. And by the end of CPE, I felt like I was competent in a lot of ways that I wasn't competent when I started. Another time this has come up is in parenting. And I'm sure other parents figured this out, possibly quicker than I did. But I didn't, again, come to realize the value of quantity time. Because I guess the story is more what you hear, or what I heard culturally growing up, is that what we really want is quality time. You're like, oh, I need to take some time off work to spend some quality time with my family, usually kind of limited. And then, especially, as a man, as a dad, you would then go back to working all the time and hardly seeing them. But I downsized myself, and so I ended up being unemployed for 9 months, and we had to move and live with friends. But the end result of this is that we had baby Poppy at the time, and so I was forced to put in a ton of quantity time as full-time dad. And it took me a while to realize the benefit of this, but it was incredible. And my relationship with her now, I think, is literally founded on this 9 months of quantity time that I had to spend with her. There's no place else to go. There's no escape. And so I discovered this value of quantity time. So this, in my mind, this idea of quantity time connects to the story of the road to Emmaus. We have another resurrection appearance of Jesus. This is the Easter season. I'm wearing white. We have white, so it tells you it's the Easter season. And that means we're talking about a lot of resurrection appearances of Jesus. These kind of strange, somewhat disjointed stories that come up in the various Gospels about Jesus appearing to his followers and groups of people and individuals after his crucifixion and death, after they found his tomb empty but weren't really sure what to do with that information. And so today we have two characters, one named Clopas or Cleopas. Can anybody name the other time that name comes up in the New Testament? We got, okay, fellow master's degree over there. Point being, blank stares, right? That's my point. And one knowing look, but mostly blank stares. Because we don't know who that is. This name only shows up one other time in the Gospels at all. This is not one of the main cast of characters that we get in the Gospel stories. It's kind of an ancillary character, like a non-speaking part until this moment very, very late in the story when suddenly Cleopas and an unnamed disciple have a lot to say. So Clopas is traveling to Emmaus with one other disciple who is probably Mary, his wife. And there's a long tradition that says that Mary was actually Jesus' auntie. And so this could have been Auntie Mary and Uncle Clopas. That's possible. No proof of that, but it's possible. But this is clearly the B team, right? This is the B team of the disciples list. Clopas probably wasn't in the upper room. We don't know. But they're traveling along the road, and suddenly someone is traveling with them and asking, hey, what are you talking about? And so they're like, are you kidding? There was just a near revolution and then an execution. There were riots. There was a whole thing. You must be the only person in the area who hasn't heard this. So the stranger says, well, tell me more. So they tell this whole story. And then still not recognizing who the stranger is, the stranger insults them and says, you guys are really struggling to understand. And then explains all the interconnectivity between the prophets and Jesus, and what the things that happened that had to happen, and what was going to happen next. And they still don't recognize who this is, this person that they spent years traveling with and learning from, until they invite him over to dinner, and he gives a blessing over bread, which any Jew would do before having bread. It's the same prayer over bread Jews sing or say now. So he gives a blessing over bread and breaks it, and then they both go, I know that guy. And then he's gone. That's the end of the story. It's a strange story. And it fits with the other resurrection appearances of Jesus all of which are very strange stories. Like Jesus appears and disappears freely and abruptly, through locked doors without opening them, into gardens when people didn't see him. And when people meet the risen Jesus, they don't recognize him at first. Like almost, I can't think of anyone who knows exactly who they're looking at. This person they knew intimately for years. And the ways that he becomes known are all different. For some, he becomes known by showing his wounds, and they poke their fingers in his death wounds from crucifixion. And some come to know him because he says their name, but he says their name in their native language, in Aramaic, and they go, "Oh, I know who you are." Or these two, Clopas and we'll say Mary, know him not when he's expounding theologically and walking along with them all day, but they know him when he sings a blessing over bread and breaks it. Sometimes he shows up and he helps the disciples with their fishing, recommends that they cast the net in another place to catch more fish, and that's how he's known. Sometimes the only thing you hear about him is that he's gone. You find the empty tomb and there's an angel who says, "You're looking for the living among the dead. He's gone ahead of you into Galilee. Go find him." These inconsistencies and the weirdness of these stories is really striking to me. Like, it's a miracle that some well-meaning editor a couple thousand years ago didn't go through and change all these stories so they fit together. Or change all these stories so they had a consistent theological agenda. Or like a political agenda. That would have been really easy. To just nudge the stories so they make a little more sense. Add some to the beginning, add some to the end. Standard practice in the ancient world. It's amazing to me, even miraculous, that no one did this. Because if they did, the stories would seem more trustworthy. Like if all the stories of Jesus' appearances were incredibly consistent and well explained and expressed the same agenda, that would make my job very easy. You wouldn't have to study this stuff very much at all. And it's amazing that didn't happen. It would have made the stories feel more trustworthy, but it would have made them actually less trustworthy as eyewitness accounts. Because that isn't how eyewitness accounts work. Eyewitness accounts don't line up. They don't match. 10 people see the same event in person, and you ask them to describe the event, and you'll get 10 different stories with differences in detail, in the order of events, even traumatic things. Like when you interview people after a shooting, and you ask them something simple like, how many bullets were fired? You will get wildly different answers. One of the more fun experiments in this area happened back in the 80s, where a researcher got 2,000 people together in front of television sets. And he showed these 2,000 people a 13-second video of a robbery. It was acted out, right? It was fake. But it looked like it was closed-circuit TV or whatever. But these 2,000 people are shown the exact same recorded event. And then they do a lineup of 5 people, and they ask which one of those 5 people committed the crime. And it basically looks like people were guessing. A fifth of them said the person's not in the lineup. They were. And then a fifth of them said it's number 1, and a fifth of them said it's number 2, and a fifth of them said it's number 5. Most of them didn't think it was 3 or 4. And so the name of the article, you can look it up, is 2,000 eyewitnesses can all be wrong. So to me, when I look at these resurrection stories that are super weird and have inconsistencies, like as Jesus is walking along on the road or breaking bread or talking, where are his wounds? Wouldn't you notice if the guy talking to you had holes through his hands, right? That's strange. But for eyewitness accounts, these inconsistencies are exactly what you'd expect if they were real experiences. If they all fit, that would be suspect. We could look at that and say, they're colluding. They met before the interview to talk out what happened, right? But they all tell stories of the same person. We hear these resurrection experiences and we're not like, who the heck is that? And when people came to understand who they were meeting, they all agreed that was who they met. They just had different experiences of it. It reminds me of my dad's funeral. So my dad passed away about a year and a half ago, and I was at his funeral with my 4 estranged Florida siblings and Poppy and my best friend and a few other people that I knew pretty well. And there are about 40 or 50 people there, most of whom I didn't know. And as they went around, they stood up and they told stories and anecdotes about my dad. And I'm looking at my friend, and I'm looking at my siblings, and we're just giving each other looks like, who are they describing? Like, who is this person that you're describing in such detail that I have never met? Because we had our own stories, right, that we would tell. And this is of a real person, a definite historical person who died a few weeks ago that we had all met, right? Already our eyewitness accounts don't match exactly. But there is a sense that we were still all describing the same person. We're just learning new things about this person from one another. So I think about Clopas and the unnamed disciple that was with him, and I don't know how much quality time they spent with Jesus. Like, they aren't mentioned when Jesus goes up the mountain multiple times. They aren't mentioned when Jesus crosses the Sea of Galilee. They aren't mentioned when Jesus goes out on a boat and the storm comes up. They aren't mentioned when Jesus invites Peter to walk on water. They're not in these big events, but they must have been around for the quantity time. Like, they were still there, because these two are faithful enough not to have run away, not to be in hiding. And if Mary is the wife of Clopas, she was at the cross when Jesus died. One of the very few people in the whole movement that had the courage to actually be there in public with him when he died. And I imagine that, I don't know how much quality time they received, but I think they got a lot of quantity time. And because of that, they were able to see the risen Jesus. And this is continued throughout Christian history. Like, there's a wide diversity of Christianities. You may not have noticed. There's like 40,000 denominations, and you may have noticed in big ones like the Roman Catholics, if you pick 3 Roman Catholics and ask them questions, you get 3 different Roman Catholicisms. I guarantee it, clergy and otherwise. And people have tried to make everyone the same. Emperor Constantine tried to force everyone's stories to match. King James tried to force everyone's stories to match. People have tried this historically and failed. And for me, this is encouraging, because it tells me that these genuine firsthand experiences of Jesus still happen. Because they're inconsistent with each other makes me think they're real and genuine and not made up. Because frankly, you would make up something more believable than what actually happens. And so the question I want to leave you with this morning is, where do you spend your quantity time? Where do you spend your quantity time? On Sunday, we try to provide a space for quality time. We do our best. For example, Sarah with a prelude, excellent. That was quality time. We try to provide that on Sunday for an hour, and then you go to the rest of your life. So where and how do you spend your quantity time? This isn't just an advertisement for volunteering for the church. Although, I mean, I won't send you away, but like, that's not what I mean. Is your quantity time spent with intention? Is the quantity of your time spent mindful or with a purpose? What shapes the way that you spend your quantity time? How do you decide what to do with the time that you have? You might remember last year for Lent, we talked about spiritual disciplines. Some people were around for that. Meditation, praying, fasting, study, simplicity, solitude, submission, service, confession, worship, guidance, celebration, and more. How much do those kinds of things take up your quantity time? Because the people who get to see and experience the risen Jesus, I think, are the people who have put in the quantity time. Amen.